I sent a cruel message to my wife when I discovered that she was at a party, hidden, with her lover. It wasn't a suspicion, it wasn't a doubt planted out of jealousy, it was the truth, naked and raw, printed in a photo that left no room for interpretation. The image appeared on my screen with the brutality of a punch to the stomach, proof that everything I believed to be solid had crumbled within seconds. At that party, in some dark corner of Boston, amid laughter and glasses of wine, she was with him. I felt the blood rush to my head, the muscles in my face contorting, my throat closing in a scream that never came. It was at that moment that I wrote the message. The words, sharp as razors, came out of me with cold clarity. I wanted her to feel the pain, I wanted each letter to be like a sharp, devastating blow. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? Enjoy the party, because tomorrow, it's all over. The scent sounded like the trigger of a fired gun. The silence afterwards was deafening, a void where my anger simmered mixed with disbelief and humiliation. How was she able? Years of life together thrown away for an adventure with a man I didn't even know existed. The worst part of all was not the betrayal itself, but the fact that she hid it so well, looked me in the eye, laughed at my jokes, slept next to me, all while building a parallel life of lies. She had always been meticulous. The phone turned down, the excuses about work, trips with friends. But now it all made sense. I was blind, or simply too trusting. The initial shock was followed by a torrent of chaotic thoughts. How many times have they met? Since when did this happen? And where the hell were they now? The answer came soon. Another photo, this time of a friend who was also at the party, a cruel and direct confirmation. Her laugh, with her lover by her side, the two of them toasting as if nothing else mattered in the world. And I was there, the fool, the betrayed man, the last to know. Something inside me broke in that instant. She had become a stranger. The woman I knew, or thought I knew, no longer existed. What was left was a distorted image of someone who lied naturally, who betrayed me as easily as someone changing clothes. I got in the car and drove. The steering wheel felt firm in my hands, as if it were the only piece of reality I could control. The streets of Boston passed by in a blur, but my mind was focused. I wanted to confront her. See the reaction on her face. I wanted her to know that I knew. But then, something stopped me. What would I do when I found her? What would be the next step? End everything there, at once. I still loved her, no matter how pathetic it seemed at the time. And that only made everything more unbearable. My hands started to shake as I parked the car, my phone blinking with notifications I didn't want to see. I needed air, space to think. But every thought was a spiral of anger, sadness, and silent despair. The image of the two of them together, laughing, celebrating something that I would never know what it was, tormented me. The betrayal had eaten away at every part of me, like poison. I had become a ghost of who I was, consumed by unanswered questions. Then, a message from her appeared. Please, can we talk? To talk. Now. After everything I had seen. It was as if she was still playing games, thinking she could fix everything with a few words. But the truth is that nothing else could be fixed. There was no trust anymore, just ruins of something that once was. The sound of the notification seemed to echo in my mind. I didn't know what to say, I didn't even know if I wanted to hear his voice. But curiosity was uncontrollable. What could she say? That it was all just a misunderstanding? That you were sorry? The truth, however, was that that night would reveal something much bigger. The lover was not just an adventure. She had trusted him in a way she had never trusted me. Everything she was, the money, the plans for the future, our lives, was, somehow, in his hands. And that night, as they toasted and I sank into anger, he prepared the final blow. She didn't know it yet, but she would be betrayed in the cruelest way possible. He didn't just steal my wife. He was going to steal her life too. Her fate was sealed, but she still had no idea. And when the blow came, she would have nowhere to run. The lover was not a man in love. He was an opportunist, and she was the final piece in his dirty game. Now, what remained to be seen was, what would I do when everything was revealed? Could her betrayal be surpassed by what was to come? Would she be able to realize that, in the end, she was just a disposable pawn in another man's game? As I looked at my cell phone screen, with her message open, I knew that nothing would be the same as before. In the silence of the house, the small details spoke louder than any words. The clock on the kitchen wall kept time with a constancy that seemed to defy the movement of the world outside. The life of the couple, Sarah and David, followed a routine that, to outsiders, seemed solid and stable. They had been together for years, long enough for the nuances of their life together to become part of the furniture, the air, every small gesture. The kind of relationship that is built on the trust that, at the end of the day, the other person will always be there, waiting on the couch, ready to share dinner and the silent moments that time brings. But, like any long relationship, there was also wear and tear, the unspoken words, the looks that avoided meeting each other at crucial moments. David was a methodical man, dedicated to his work, with his mind always involved in some project or calculation. An engineer by training, he spent much of his time in the office, a minimalist space, with dark wooden furniture and shelves full of technical books. He loved what he did, but in recent years, that love seemed to compete directly with his marriage. It wasn't something he admitted to himself, but the long days at work and the late nights when he returned home silently had a weight that he couldn't measure. His relationship with Sarah had somehow shaped itself to this rhythm. She understood him. Or at least that's what he thought. Sarah, on the other hand, had a calm presence. She worked in art, spending her days in a studio on the top floor of the house, surrounded by unfinished canvases and paint scattered in controlled disorder. Space was the perfect antithesis of David's world, and perhaps that was what had always balanced them. While he lived in a universe of logic and precision, Sarah was driven by emotions and instinct. She expressed herself more freely, and her studio reflected this vibrant personality that still lived within her, even when her life with David seemed to sink into a deep, almost stagnant calm. Friends always commented on how they seemed like a perfect couple, almost untouchable by the crises that hit other couples around them. But there was something about the silences between them, a feeling that what was unsaid was gathering like a thin, invisible layer of dust that, over time, became noticeable. Evenings of deep conversation had become rare, and daily routines, once comfortable, now seemed devoid of spontaneity. Even when they were together, there seemed to be a growing distance, something they both noticed but, for some reason, never mentioned. In the early years of their marriage, David and Sarah traveled together frequently. They loved discovering new places, small distant and unknown cities. Each trip was a shared adventure, filled with moments of intimacy and discovery that brought them together in ways few couples get to experience. But over time, David's work and Sarah's increasing commitments to her art exhibitions eroded these escapades. The trips became less frequent, and eventually they disappeared from their lives completely. This weighed heavily on Sarah's shoulders, as she missed the companionship they had before. I still loved him deeply, but I was beginning to question whether that love was enough to fill the emptiness I felt. On the rare nights they had dinner together, the conversation revolved around practical matters, David's work, Sarah's next exhibition, the household bills. Occasionally, an uncomfortable silence would emerge, as if neither of them knew what else to say. And when they tried to talk about something deeper, the conversation was soon interrupted by some distraction, a call from work, an urgent email, or even the exhaustion of both of them, who preferred silence to discussion. David always believed that their marriage was proof against any difficulties. He knew Sarah was bothered by his absence, but deep down he believed she understood his responsibilities, his love for work. I thought that, at the end of it all, she would always be there, waiting, as she always was. There was an unwavering confidence in it, something he never allowed himself to question. Sarah, on the other hand, felt the weight of growing loneliness, although she never verbalized it either. She didn't want to be a burden, she didn't want to be the one who complained or demanded. He learned to keep his frustration to himself, focusing on his canvases and the colors he used to paint. Colors were, for Sarah, a way of expressing what she couldn't express in words. There were times when she wondered if the love she felt for David was still the same. The affection was there, but was there still passion? She saw the man she had married transformed by time, by work, by routine. He was still attractive, he still had that smile that made her melt when she first met him, but now he seemed like a distant, almost unattainable man. The nights they slept side by side, separated by an invisible abyss, were the worst. She watched him sleep, his chest rising and falling slowly, and wondered if he felt the same. If he still thought about her like he used to. That particular morning, Sarah woke up alone in bed. David had already left for work, as he always did. A note on the kitchen table indicated that he had an important meeting and would be back late. It was like that most days. The morning solitude was already a constant companion for her, as was the coffee cooling on the table as she looked at the windows of the studio upstairs. The curtains let in a strand of light that illuminated her canvases, and, for a few seconds, she allowed herself to get lost in the colors displayed there. It was a refuge. Their relationship seemed, to the outside world, something impeccable, but behind the doors of the house, the two lived parallel realities. Sarah wondered if they could somehow regain the connection they once had. Conversations with her friends about marriage and the future didn't bring the answers she was looking for. She felt trapped, sometimes guilty for wanting more than she had, other times just sad because of the feeling that something had been lost, but she couldn't say exactly what. That same afternoon, while he was painting, he received a message from David. He warned that the meeting had extended and that he would not return home until very late. Sarah read the message with a silent sigh. That no longer surprised her. He put his cell phone aside and concentrated on his brushstrokes again, trying to push away the thoughts that were beginning to form. There was something in her that longed for change, for a break from the monotony that seemed to dominate her life. But what would that be? Even she didn't know for sure. Their relationship was not marked by fights or intense arguments. It was the absence of any conflict that, ironically, worried her most. When was the last time you actually discussed something? When was the last time she felt her heart race when she saw him walk through the door? These questions remained unanswered as she moved between the canvases, trying to find some kind of way out of the chaos of colors she created. And so, their lives went on. Two parallel paths that, from time to time, crossed, but never truly came together. Sarah and David moved on, each carrying their own doubts and dissatisfactions, without ever putting them into words. And as time passed, they barely noticed that the distance between them grew every day. Until, one day, something would finally change. But for now, the silence persisted. The days that followed were always the same. David immersed in his work, Sarah in her studio, surrounded by colors and shapes that brought some tranquility to the chaos that was growing inside her. The routine no longer caused that familiar comfort, but rather a kind of apathy, as if everything was on autopilot. At night, the two would meet in the kitchen, sometimes exchanging a few words about the day. Sarah watched David as he ate, in silence, and wondered how they got there. How what was once full of life and passion had turned into this, a kind of mechanical coexistence, where love seemed to have been replaced by mere coexistence. She had tried. She tried for years to reconnect with him, to create moments in which they could recapture some of the joy they once shared. I planned small surprises, suggested outings, tried to start conversations that could break the monotony. But David, always so involved in his work, rarely responded. It wasn't out of malice, and she knew it. But knowing didn't make things easier. He was absent, even when present. And over time, Sarah began to feel a void that seemed impossible to fill. It was on one of these nights, when David was back at the office late again, that Sarah noticed something different. It wasn't a clear thought, but a feeling, a kind of restlessness that made her alert. Over the past few months, she had engaged in frequent conversations with someone who seemed to be always available, always ready to listen. It wasn't intentional at first, he was just a friend, someone she could vent to when the loneliness became too much. He had a comforting presence, and his advice was always gentle, never invasive. But, without realizing it, these conversations began to take on a different tone. Sarah looked at her phone often now, waiting for a message. That feeling of nervousness that I hadn't felt in a while began to reappear, but it wasn't because of David. It was for someone else. A man who made her feel alive again, who made her laugh, who made her question whether the life she was leading was enough. Her hands shook slightly as she read the messages, and despite trying to rationalize what was happening, she couldn't help the way things were going. At first, Sarah refused to admit that this was a betrayal. They were just conversations, right? Nothing had actually happened. But there was a fine line that, deep down, she knew was about to be crossed. The feeling of guilt crept in from time to time, but it was quickly drowned out by the excitement of being wanted again, of being seen, heard. Something that David, despite all the years of marriage, seemed to have forgotten how to do. The messages became more frequent, the conversations more intimate, and soon they weren't just words. They met occasionally, in discreet cafes, away from known eyes. They weren't planned meetings, but something that seemed natural, as if they were both being carried by an invisible current. Sarah was surprised by how easily it all happened, as if fate was conspiring for them to follow that path. One afternoon, while painting in the studio, the phone vibrated on the table. It was him, asking if they could meet that night. David, as always, would be working late, so there was no reason not to go. She looked at her phone screen for a few seconds before responding, her heart beating faster than normal. I knew this meeting would be different. She knew that, this time, she could no longer deny herself what she was about to do. They met in a small, out-of-the-way restaurant, the kind of place where no one would recognize them. Sarah felt her heart racing in her chest, but it wasn't from fear. It was excitement. The conversation flowed as always, easy, light. He made her laugh, and for a few hours, she allowed herself to forget the life she led, her husband who was at home working, the emptiness she felt when she met David's eyes at night. And it was there, under the low lights of the restaurant, that she realized there was no turning back. The moment they left the restaurant and got into the car, she knew what was coming next. And yet, he didn't hesitate. The guilt that sometimes rose in his chest was absent at that moment. There was only the desire to feel alive again, to forget for a moment the monotony that consumed her. That night, Sarah crossed a line that, until then, she had only skirted. When he returned home hours later, he found the house dark and silent, as always. David still hadn't returned, and for a second, she felt a pang of relief. He went up the stairs to his room, his mind still spinning with everything that had happened. Her body was still pulsing with the adrenaline of the encounter, and she couldn't decide if what she felt was guilt or something close to freedom. The next few days were a blur of conflicting emotions. She still met with him, hiding her messages and encounters with the skill of someone who had practiced lying long enough. And, at the same time, she continued living her life alongside David, divided between two realities that no longer seemed to fit together. David, on the other hand, continued without noticing the subtle changes around him. He was more focused than ever on his projects, with his career growing at an accelerated pace. Nights at home became quieter than ever, but for him, it was just the normal pace of things. He trusted Sarah completely, as much as he trusted himself. The idea that something was wrong, that something could be happening outside of his vision, was simply unthinkable. But like all lies, the truth was about to emerge. It was just a matter of time. On a night that seemed like any other, David decided to come home early from work. He was tired, and the idea of spending a few more hours with Sarah seemed comforting. When he arrived home, he found the house empty. Nothing out of place, just the usual silence. He wasn't worried at first, believing she might be in the studio or at an appointment with her friends. But when he checked his phone, he noticed something was strange. No message from Sarah, no sign of where she might be. An uncomfortable feeling began to grow in his chest. Not knowing what to expect, David decided to call a mutual friend, someone he knew was at a party that night, a party he had been invited to but had declined due to work. What he heard on the other end of the line was a blow that made him lose his breath for a few seconds. Sarah was there, at the party, and she wasn't alone. David remained standing in the middle of the room, his cell phone still in his hand, his heart beating too fast. That single sentence from his friend echoed in his mind, as he tried to process the information. Sarah was at the party, with another man. He didn't want to believe it. His body reacted before his mind understood. He felt heat rising up his neck, tension building in his shoulders, as his head swam. How was that possible? Years of coexistence, of life together, now seemed to crumble before a simple sentence. Without thinking, David grabbed his car keys and left. The steering wheel was firm in his hands, his thoughts mixed with images of Sarah. Every memory of the last few years seemed to take on a new color. All the little details he had ignored or rationalized, the nights she was distant, the silent dinners, the excuses about commitments. All of this fit into a narrative he didn't want to accept. Something inside him knew there was a truth being revealed, and yet, he still fought against it. He arrived at the party faster than he imagined. Loud music leaked through the walls of the building, lights flickering through the windows. It was a place David would never associate with Sarah. The kind of environment she avoided, or at least used to avoid. He felt out of place, adrenaline coursing through his body, but he remained focused. There was no more room for doubt. He needed to see her with his own eyes. When he entered, the sound of music filled his ears, drowning out his thoughts. The place was full, but it wasn't difficult to locate her. Sarah was there, exactly as her friend had described, smiling, laughing, with a man by her side. They seemed carefree, oblivious to the rest of the world, wrapped in a bubble of their own. David stopped, watching from afar, unable to move for a few seconds. The impact of that scene paralyzed him. The woman with whom he shared his life, his dreams, now stood before him, but she seemed like a different person. She was a stranger. When he finally got closer, Sarah saw him. The smile on his face instantly disappeared, his body stiffened, and the man beside him noticed the heavy atmosphere that had appeared in the air. David was a few steps away from her, his gaze fixed, his heart pounding. He didn't say anything right away. It didn't need to. The silence between them spoke more than any words could. David, Sarah began, but her voice was fragile, almost lifeless. She knew there wasn't enough justification for that. I knew he wasn't there by chance. What's going on here? He finally broke the silence, his voice low, carrying a tension that Sarah hadn't heard before. Her eyes fixed on the man beside her. The stranger tried to avoid the confrontation, but his presence there, next to Sarah, spoke for itself. Sarah hesitated, searching for words that could at least explain what he saw, but the truth was that there was no simple explanation. She looked at the man beside her, her lover, and suddenly the guilt she had tried so hard to ignore seemed overwhelming. Everything she had done, the choices she had made, now, in front of David, everything seemed unsustainable. We need to talk, David, she whispered, but he didn't look away. The surrounding environment disappeared for the two of them. There was no more partying, no more music, just the confrontation unfolding before them. David's chest felt heavy, as if something was compressing it. He had imagined scenarios, tried to rationalize what was happening, but nothing had prepared him for this vision. The man next to Sarah seemed uncomfortable, avoiding looking directly at him, but he still didn't leave her side. With him? David asked, his voice thick with disbelief. He didn't need to ask. The answer was already clear, evident in Sarah's expression, in the nervous gestures she tried to contain. Sarah took a deep breath, her eyes teary but still steady. She knew there was no more lying. There was no way around what had already been done. "I never wanted it to be like this," she said, her voice wavering. "I don't know how we got to this point, but it happened. And I'm sorry, David." He didn't respond right away. Her words resonated, but they didn't make sense. "I'm very sorry." How could that be true? How was what he was seeing, hearing, living in that moment his life? The pain he felt now was much deeper than he could express. He thought about all the nights he blindly trusted, all the times he ignored the signs, how he was so sure their marriage was solid. Now it all seemed like a farce. The man next to Sarah finally found the courage to speak, trying to break the oppressive atmosphere that hung over the three of them. "Look, I think we should talk somewhere else," he said, but David interrupted him. "No," David's voice was firm. "It won't be here, and it won't be with you." He looked at Sarah once again, his heart racing, his mind struggling to organize his thoughts. There were so many questions he wanted to ask, so many things that didn't make sense, but at that moment, what weighed most was the emptiness, the betrayal that manifested itself in every part of his body. Without saying another word, he turned and left, leaving Sarah and her lover behind. The sound of the party resumed its intensity as he walked away, but to him, it was as if the world had gone completely silent. He walked out of the building, feeling the cool night air hit his face. Reality was finally settling in his mind. He had been betrayed. The woman he loved, whom he trusted, had lied to him, had gotten involved with another man. The marriage, which he had always thought was unshakable, had been destroyed before his eyes. Every step he took away from the party felt heavier, as if he were leaving behind not just that night, but the entire life he had built with Sarah. When he got home, David didn't know what to do. He sat on the couch, staring into space, the phone still in his hand. What he had seen and heard that night seemed like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. The emotions came in waves: anger, sadness, disbelief. How had that happened? What had Sarah found in the other man that he couldn't offer? He pulled out his cell phone, scrolling through Sarah's old messages, trying to find signs of when things started to fall apart. The messages seemed normal, casual, but now he knew that behind each one there were secrets, lies. It was impossible not to feel the lump in my throat tighten even more. Until a notification appeared. It was not from Sarah, but from an unknown number. David opened the message and suddenly everything started to make sense. Sarah's lover, the one she was getting involved with, wasn't just any man. He was a scammer, someone who approached married women, involved them emotionally and then, destroyed them financially. David, still processing everything that had happened that night, now faced the truth in a raw and inescapable way. The secret that Sarah kept went far beyond emotional or physical betrayal. She had trusted him with so much more than her heart. David took a deep breath. That revelation was just the beginning. David stood there, standing in the middle of the room, his cell phone in his hand. The world around him began to lose focus. The message on the display seemed to vibrate in his mind, trapping him in a reality he had never imagined living. Sarah's lover wasn't just a physical or emotional betrayal, he had come into her life for a much crueler purpose. David felt the ground shake beneath his feet, anger, pain and feelings of helplessness mixing together. How could she get involved to this point, giving so much of herself to a complete stranger? The phone vibrated again in his hands. It was Sarah, calling. He hesitated for a moment, his thumb hovering over the answer button, but finally relented. The silence between them was suffocating when he answered the call, only the heavy sound of her breathing on the other end. "David, can we talk?" Her voice sounded hesitant, almost pleading. He held the phone tighter, his jaw clenched with tension. For a moment, he didn't know if he could say a word without exploding. But then, with a colossal effort, he spoke, his voice low and restrained. "To talk." He repeated, feeling the sarcasm and pain in each syllable. Now do you want to talk? I know this seems, Sarah tried to continue, but David interrupted her. What does it look like, Sarah? The anger finally emerged. Does it seem like a betrayal? Because that's what it is. I saw you with him. I saw it with my own eyes. On the other end of the line, he could hear Sarah gasping, perhaps surprised by the intensity of his reaction. She knew there were no more excuses. He knew that, at that moment, words were irrelevant given what had been exposed. David, please. I can explain, her voice trailed off, struggling to remain calm. Explain. He let out a bitter laugh, moving around the room like a caged animal. What exactly do you want to explain? That you lied to me for months. Who got involved with another man while I was working, believing we were fine? Or maybe you want to explain to me how you plan to continue living this lie. The silence on the other side was deafening. David expected an answer, something that could at least give some meaning to what he was feeling, but nothing. Just the sound of Sarah breathing, her failed attempts to find justification. David, she began, but he could no longer hold back the torrent of feelings that invaded him. I trusted you. He screamed, the pain finally releasing. I believed every word of yours, every excuse you made, while you were with him. You threw away what we built, you threw away our marriage like it meant nothing. He heard Sarah sobbing on the other side, but it brought him no relief. There was no comfort in seeing her suffer, not when the betrayal had already been completed. No matter how much she cried, nothing would take away the weight he felt in his chest. She destroyed something much deeper than just the trust between them. David let out a shaky breath, turning away from the phone for a moment, as if the simple act of talking to her was draining all of his energy. He knew he needed to control his anger, he needed to understand what to do next. But how does someone overcome a betrayal of this magnitude? How could you? His voice was lower, more tired now. How could you do this to me, Sarah? With us? Sarah, on the other side, was now openly crying. She knew there were no easy answers. Nothing she said now would change what she had done. But there was something more, something she hadn't yet revealed, and that weighed as much as her betrayal. David. She began, and he heard the hesitation in her voice. I didn't want it to be like this. I didn't want things to get out of control, but, she stopped, searching for words. David waited, his heart beating fast. But what, Sarah? What else can there be? He's not who I thought he was, she finally revealed, her voice trailing off. He tricked me, David. He didn't just deceive me, he took everything from me. David was silent for a moment, trying to understand what she meant. He thought about her words, trying to process. He tricked me. Took everything from you. David repeated slowly, as if he needed her to clarify. What are you talking about? Sarah let out a heavy sigh, and David could hear the shame in her breath, the weight she carried in every word. I trusted him, David. It wasn't just a case, she confessed, her voice shaking. I believed he was different. He said all the right things, made me feel alive again, like everything that was missing in our marriage he could give me. And I was naive. I believed every word. And when I realized, it was already too late. David felt the weight of her words falling on him like a bucket of cold water. He knew she had betrayed him, but he didn't imagine it was something so deep. She had trusted her lover with much more than just her feelings. I had trusted him with everything. Your money, your savings, your future plans. Everything had been placed in the hands of a man who had now disappeared. He made me transfer money, everything I had, Sarah whispered, barely audible. And now he's gone. With everything. David didn't know how to react. The emotional betrayal was already hard enough to bear, but now, there was an extra layer of destruction. She didn't just betray their marriage, she ruined her own finances, put their lives at risk in ways he could never imagine. Did you give him all our money? The disbelief in his voice was palpable. I thought he cared, Sarah sobbed, clearly devastated. I was so stupid, David. I screwed up, and now I don't know what to do. David was silent. Her words hit him hard, but at the same time, there was a part of him that no longer cared about the money, the bills, what she had lost. What he felt at that moment was a pain much deeper than any material loss could cause. What she had destroyed between them could not be recovered with excuses or practical solutions. The love, the trust, the life they had built together, all of it now seemed irreparably broken. Sarah continued to speak, her words broken by sobs, but David could no longer hear her. The sound of her tears mixed with his own thoughts as he tried to somehow comprehend what was coming next. He knew the life they had was over. And at that moment, the only thing left was to decide how he would face destruction. What would he do with the truth now revealed? When he finished that part, David hung up the phone, without saying anything else. He knew there were more conversations to come, more decisions to be made. But at that moment, he just needed silence. The silence before the storm. David lay motionless on the couch, his phone abandoned beside him, the weight of the revelation still pressing down on his chest. He had hung up without saying a word, without answering Sarah, because at that moment there was nothing more to be said. Her betrayal had gone far beyond what he imagined, reaching a level of destruction that went beyond the emotional. Now, it wasn't just their marriage that was in pieces, but their entire life together was financially and emotionally devastated. The silence around him was almost palpable, and he wondered how long he could stay like this, not moving, not thinking. But the thought came, inevitable, what would he do now? Did the love he had felt for Sarah still exist in some form? Would he be able to look at her without feeling the weight of betrayal? Did he want to forgive her? The moral dilemma that consumed him was suffocating. He knew that, rationally, he had lost something much bigger than money, and somehow that bothered him less than it should. The broken trust was what really mattered. How could he forgive her after everything? But at the same time, an inner voice forced him to question. Sarah, despite everything, had been a victim too. She had fallen for her lover's lies, just as he had fallen for hers. David closed his eyes, rubbing his temples, trying to shake off the headache that was beginning to appear. What would he do? The desire to confront her face to face, to demand more answers, was growing within him. But he feared what he might discover, he feared that, deep down, there were no more answers to be given. Everything was already exposed. Everything was already destroyed. Hours had passed, perhaps even longer than he realized, when he heard the front door slowly open. The sound of soft footsteps echoed through the room, and he knew it was Sarah. She was there. He didn't turn around immediately, but he could feel the weight of her presence. The air between them felt thick, full of everything unsaid. David remained where he was, breathing deeply, preparing himself for the inevitable confrontation. David, her voice sounded hesitant, almost a whisper. Can we talk now? For a few seconds, he didn't respond. His body was tense, his muscles rigid from holding on to his anger and pain. Finally, he stood up, turning to face her. She was standing near the door, her eyes swollen and red from crying, her body hunched over as if carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. That vision, somehow, hit him in a different way. Sarah, despite everything, looked broken. It was hard for him not to remember that as much as she was responsible for so much, she was also a victim of her own choices. She started to speak, but the words failed, a sob escaping. She looked small, vulnerable, very different from the confident, vibrant woman he had met years ago. David took a step towards him, not knowing exactly what he wanted to say or do. He wanted to scream at her, demand that she explain how everything had gotten to this point. I wanted her to say there was some solution, some way to reverse what had been done. But he knew this was impossible. I don't know where to start, Sarah said finally, her voice low and broken. I have no excuses, David. I was wrong in every possible way. I destroyed everything, our marriage, our life. His voice faltered, tears filling his eyes again. David watched her in silence. Her words seemed so weak, so incapable of fixing anything. But he felt an emptiness inside him, as if the anger that had consumed him before was now transformed into something heavier. Resignation, perhaps. Despair, even. Why did you do that, Sarah? He asked, his voice calmer than he expected. What were you looking for? I don't understand. We had a life together. I know it wasn't perfect, but, why all this? She stared at him, her face marked with pain, and sighed, as if her next words required more strength than she had. I was lost, David, she admitted, her voice breaking. I didn't know who I was anymore. You were always distant, always focused on work, and I felt alone. But I know that's not a justification. I should have talked to you, I should have fought for our marriage. But I was a coward. I thought I could find elsewhere what I missed here. And that was my mistake. The biggest mistake of my life. David felt her words hit him, each one piercing his emotional barrier. He knew that the distance between them had grown in recent years, he knew that things were no longer the same as before, but he had never imagined that Sarah would reach this point. He wondered if, at some point, he could have done something different. It could have prevented her from seeking in another man what she should have found in him. And now? He asked, his voice rough. What's left, Sarah? Everything we had was destroyed. You betrayed me. He took everything from you, from us. She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and took a hesitant step toward him. I don't know, David, she confessed, her voice almost inaudible. I don't know if we can fix this. I don't even know if you can forgive me. But I'm willing to try. I don't want to lose everything we built, even if I destroyed so much. David closed his eyes for a moment, his chest heavy with the burden of the decision he knew he would have to make. The moral dilemma was there, clear as day. Did he still love Sarah? Could he forgive her, even after everything? Or was that love forever tainted by betrayal? Questions swirled in his mind as he stood there, looking at the woman he had loved for so many years, but who now seemed like a stranger. A part of him wanted to go away, leave everything behind and start again. But another part wondered if it was possible to rebuild something from the ashes. I don't know if I can forgive, he said finally, his voice firm. Not now. Maybe never. But, he took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision that was about to come. If there is any chance, any slight chance of rebuilding something, then, we need time. And, Sarah, you need to show me that you're willing to fight for this. I don't know if I can give you another chance, but if you're going to try, you need to make it count. She nodded, with tears in her eyes, and said nothing more. They both knew the journey ahead would be uncertain and full of pain. But at that moment, the most important thing was said. The days that followed that night were filled with a strange, dense silence that seemed to hover between David and Sarah like an invisible barrier. She had gone back to sleeping in the guest room, while he remained in the master suite. It wasn't an official separation, but they both knew there was a gap between them, something that couldn't be bridged easily. Sarah was hesitantly trying to get back to her routine, but everything seemed different now. The studio that previously welcomed her in moments of crisis seemed empty, without purpose. Every brushstroke she tried to make on her canvases was a reminder of what she had lost, of what she had destroyed with her own hands. David, in turn, was also lost in his thoughts. At work, he kept up appearances, he was efficient, precise, focused. But inside him, the whirlwind of emotions consumed him. He wanted to forget, he wanted to start over, but he didn't know if he was capable. What Sarah had done still weighed on him like a constant shadow. Worse than the physical or emotional betrayal, what really haunted him was the fact that she had given herself to her lover to the point of losing everything. David could understand the loneliness, the detachment, even the momentary weakness, but the extent of the destruction left him speechless. On this particular morning, David sat at the kitchen table, the silence broken only by the sound of coffee being poured into his cup. He was tired, emotionally exhausted. Sarah had left early, saying she needed to take care of some business, but he didn't ask where she was going. The conversations between them had become merely functional, cold. Any trace of affection that had once existed was now lost somewhere inside them. As he stared at his coffee cup, David's mind wandered to the countless possibilities of how his life could be different. I wondered if, somewhere in the past, he had missed the chance to save his marriage, if perhaps there was something he could have done differently. But now, looking at the present, reality was pulling him back with relentless brutality. The truth was that nothing could be the same as before. Sarah's choices had led them both down a path of no return. Hours later, Sarah returned home. There was a change in his posture, something more resolute, as if he had made a decision. She walked through the door with calm steps, but her face revealed the weight of what she was about to say. David, sensing the tension in the air, put down the newspaper he was pretending to read and watched her, feeling a strange calm before the storm. "We need to talk," she said, her voice firm but soft. David nodded silently, gesturing for her to sit across from him. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," Sarah began, her hands clasped nervously on the table. "About us, about what I did, about how things got to this point. And I know I can't undo what's been done. I can't take back what I destroyed." David remained silent, watching her. He could see the truth in her eyes. She was broken, maybe more than he was. The choices she had made were consuming her as much as they were consuming him. "I made a decision," she continued, taking a deep breath. "I'm leaving, David." The words hung in the air, absorbed by the silence of the house. David blinked, surprised but not shocked. He always knew something like this could happen, but hearing the words coming out of her mouth made it all more real. "What?" he asked, more to fill the silence than to express doubt. "I destroyed everything we had. And now, no matter how hard I try, I can't imagine how the two of us can stay together. You don't deserve to bear the weight of what I did. And I need to find out who I am again. I need time for that, and I can't do that here." David didn't know what to answer. Part of him felt an immediate relief, a desire to finally be able to move on, but another part was still connected to her, to the past, to the memories of who they once were. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice softer than he imagined it would be. "There's no going back after this, Sarah." "Yes," she said firmly. "I need to go." She paused, searching for the right words. "I screwed up and I know that maybe you will never be able to forgive me. But I hope that one day you find a way to move on. And, maybe I'll find it too." David nodded slowly, processing her words. He looked at the woman who had once been the love of his life, and realized that now there was only an echo of what they had been. The betrayal, the pain, the loss, it had all eroded what they had built. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe letting her go was the right thing to do. "I hope you find what you're looking for too, Sarah," he said finally, his voice calm but filled with a deep melancholy. She stood up, slowly, as if the weight of the moment was weighing down her every movement. She picked up her bag, looked at him one last time, and opened the door. When she left, David didn't follow her with his eyes. He just stood there, still, listening to the sound of the door closing behind her. Months passed. David's life slowly began to find a new normal. He didn't know if he could love again, if he could trust anyone after all, but, little by little, he began to heal his wounds. Sarah was never a part of his life again. She had disappeared, leaving only memories. There were no phone calls, no attempts at reconciliation. It was as if they had never existed for each other. David learned to live with silence, to find peace in the small routines of everyday life. Work continued to be his constant, and, from time to time, he allowed himself to think about the future. Maybe, one day, he could start again, with someone who truly loved him, without secrets, without betrayals. As for Sarah, she also started a new life. Away from David, away from the past. But what she had lost followed her like a shadow, and she knew she could never erase the mistakes she made. Deep down, she always wondered if she could have done something different. But the truth is that some wounds never heal completely. Life took its course for both of them. And although their paths parted, the scars of that destroyed relationship remained with them, reminding them that sometimes forgiveness isn't enough to heal what was broken. If you've made it this far, leave in the comments what you thought of this story and share your opinion about the characters' choices. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more impactful stories like this. Remember, our channel does not support any type of betrayal. Betrayal hurts, destroys bonds and leaves deep marks. Until next time.